But in none of these interpretations is the literal meaning of Genesis to be denied. Regardless of the spiritual or mythological meanings one wishes to assign to such language, the fact remains that the earth was literally formless and void until God's Spirit moved upon the waters of the first day of creation. In fact, the very reason that biblical writers can use the words of Genesis as metaphors in other parts of Scripture is that those writers knew that the events in Genesis happened literally as recorded. It is the veracity of the history which gives rise to the metaphors, as St. Paul teaches in Galatians 4 in the story of Sarah and Hagar, a story in which he indicates that these two women represent two respective covenants. Yet Paul neither denied the actual existence of Sarah and Hagar, nor did he suggest that the historical events surrounding their confrontation in Genesis 16 never actually occurred as recorded. Pope Leo also warned that interpreting Scripture, we must pay close attention to the guidance of the Church, especially the writings of the early fathers. He writes in Providentissimus Deus, quote, "And therefore, that it is permitted to no one to interpret Holy Scripture against a sense or also against the unanimous agreement of the fathers. By this most wise decree, the Church by no means prevents or restrains the pursuit of biblical science, but rather protects it from error and largely assists its real progress." Again, he says, "And therefore that is permitted to no one to interpret the Holy Scripture against such a sense or against the unanimous agreement of the fathers." He adds, "The professor of Holy Scripture, therefore, amongst all other recommendations, must be well acquainted with the whole circle of theology and deeply read in the commentaries of the Holy Fathers and Doctors and other interpreters of Mark." And again he says, "The Holy Fathers, we say, are of supreme authority. Whenever they all interpret in one and the same manner any text of the Bible as pertaining to the doctrine of faith or morals, for their unanimity clearly evinces that such interpretation has come down from the apostles as a matter of Catholic faith." Unquote. It is a fact that the patristic consensus on the interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2, with very few exceptions, delineates an ex nihilo creation in a sequence of 6 24-hour days. In fact, the patristic consensus on the interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 is equal to, or often stronger than, many other dogmas the Church holds to today. For example, the real presence, confession, confirmation, the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption of Mary, the canon of Scripture, purgatory and indulgences, etc. Finally, Leo cautions, in a remark we previously cited concerning the necessity to adhere to the literal and obvious sense of Scripture, quote, "But he must not on that account consider that it is forbidden, when just cause exists, to push inquiry and exposition beyond what the fathers have done, provided he carefully observes the rules so wisely laid down by St. Augustine, not to depart from the literal and obvious sense, except only where reason makes it untenable or necessity requires." We should take strong notice of Leo's statement that if anyone wishes to go beyond what the fathers have taught, he can do so, provided that he not depart from interpreting Scripture in its literal and obvious sense. This implies that the fathers interpreted Scripture in its literal and obvious sense, and if one wishes to add to the fathers' teaching, one must follow the same hermeneutic. The only exception to this, as Leo cites Augustine's work, The Literal Interpretation of Genesis, is if the discovered facts were to show with irrefutable evidence that a certain Scripture cannot be interpreted in its literal and obvious sense. But this necessarily means that until such irrefutable evidence is forthcoming, Leo's mandate means that Scripture must be interpreted only in its literal and obvious sense. In Augustine's letter to St. Jerome, he writes, "For I confess to your charity that I have learned to regard those books of Scripture now called canonical, and them alone,